On the night of March 26, 1945, a column of 16 tanks and 300 men idles in the dark outside Aschaffenburg. Engines warm, waiting for a single word. The men do not know where they are going, their maps are thin. Their objective lies Neufties east, 50 miles behind a German line that has not yet broken. The order came down from the most famous American general of the war. It will cost almost every man in that column his freedom, his health, or his life. And the reason for it will be buried by the man who gave it. You have likely heard George Patton described in one register. The pearl-handled pistols, the speeches, the slap, the general who was always right and always moving forward. This has been repeated so often, it has taken on the quality of legend. But legends deserve a second, harder look. Patton made a decision that his own staff begged him not to make, that broke his own staff begged him rules of war, that he would spend the rest of his life refusing to explain honestly. This is the version that did not make the headlines. The target was Oflag XIII-B, a prisoner of war camp near the town of Hammelburg. Inside its wire sat roughly 1,500 American officers and Salvation Serbian officers on starvation rations in barracks that barely cleared freezing. Patton commanded the US Third Army, the right hand of the Allied drive into Germany. Liberating a POW camp 50 miles past your own front in March of 1945, with the war nearly won, is not a normal order. Senior commanders do not gamble armored units on it. So the question that hangs over the whole mission is simple. Why this camp? Why now? Before we go further, if untold history like this is what you came for, subscribe. It helps keep these coming. Because the answer to why this camp is a name, and it is a name Patton did not want anyone to say out loud. Inside the wire at Hammelburg was a thin, exhausted lieutenant colonel named John Knight Waters. He had survived North Africa, a German prison train, and a forced march across the Polish winter, and he was married to a young woman named Beatrice. Her father was George Patton. The man ordering the raid was the prisoner's father-in-law. That single fact is the engine of everything that follows, and the fact Patton would build a wall of denials around for the rest of his life. To understand why Patton would risk an armored column for one man, we have to go back 2 years, to the defeat that put that man behind wire in the first place, and that Patton took as a personal wound. In February of 1943, in the desert of Tunisia, the Green US Army met Owen Rommel's veterans at a gap in the mountains called Kasserine Pass. It was a humiliation. American units were overrun, scattered, surrendered. Among the officers swept up in that collapse was a young West Pointer named John Waters. Waters was no stranger to the Patton family. He had married Patton's eldest daughter before the war. Patton had watched the young man's career the way a hard father watches a son he will never quite say he loves, and now Waters was gone, captured, his name on a German prisoner list beyond reach. Patton wrote about him. He worried about him in letters home. For 2 years, as the Third Army fought across France and into Germany, the son-in-law sat in a succession of camps, and Patton could do nothing. Generals do not get to rescue one prisoner. Waters' war as a prisoner was its own ordeal. As the Red Army closed from the east in early 1945, the Germans emptied their eastern camps and drove the prisoners west on foot. Waters walked hundreds of miles through the freezing winter, half-starved, one figure in a grey river of exhausted men. That march delivered him, in early March of 1945, to Oflag XIII-B at Hammelburg. He had survived 2 years and a death march only to arrive, by pure accident, almost within reach of his father-in-law's tanks. And here is the first hard fact in the case against Patton. American intelligence believed senior US officers had been moved into Hammelburg, knew the camp held high hotel prison. Whether Patton knew for certain specifically was inside has been argued for 80 years. But on the very day the task force rolled out, Patton wrote the task for his wife that referred to Waters being at that camp. He told her, in writing, what he would later tell the army he never knew. There was a second tell. Patton attached his own personal aide, Major Alexander Stiller, to the raiding force. Stiller had no tactical reason to ride along on a suicide mission, but Stiller knew Waters by sight. He could pick the son-in-law out of 1,000 ragged prisoners. A general who truly did not know who was in the camp does not send a man whose only special skill is recognizing a particular face. The denials had not even begun, and the evidence against them was already loaded onto the half-tracks. The mission was handed to the 4th Armored Division, Patton's sharpest spearhead, the division that had cracked the ring around Bastogne 3 months earlier, and here the relationship at the heart of this story widens. Command of the operation fell into the orbit of Lieutenant Creighton Abrams, one of the finest armor officers the US Army ever produced. Decades later, the Army would name its main battle tank, the M1 Abrams, after him. Abrams looked at the order, and Abrams pushed back. Abrams understood what the map was telling him. 50 miles through hostile country against unknown to walk, and then 50 miles back, slower, burdened, hunted the whole way. He argued for a real force, a full combat command, thousands of men, the weight to fight through and fight back out. It was a sound military judgment. It was the judgment of a man who would one day run the entire army, and Patton overruled it. He approved a force of just over 300. Think about the logic of that number. If the goal was to liberate 1,500 prisoners and bring them home, 300 men was absurd. Abrams was right. But if the real goal was to slip in and slip out before the Germans could react, then a small, fast column made a terrible kind of sense. The size of the force was itself a confession. The mission was not built to free a camp. It was built to extract a man. Command of the column itself went to a tough, young officer named Captain Abraham Baum, a tailor's son from the Bronx, exactly the kind of soldier Patton trusted with the impossible. Years later, in his own account of the night recorded in the book Raid, the untold story of Patton's secret mission, Baum described the moment Major Stiller finally told him the real objective. Not the camp, but the man inside it. Baum had not been told he was being sent 50 miles into Germany without knowing why. He would find out at the gate. So the pieces were set, every one of them wrong. A force 1/10 the size its commanders wanted, a route through 50 miles of enemy ground, a secret objective hidden even from the man leading the raid, a general's aid aboard for the sole purpose of identifying one prisoner, and a column of young men who believed they were on a mission to free 1,000 of their own, and were, in truth, the price of a private rescue. At a little after midnight, the engines came up. The column moved east into the dark. The first hours go well, and that is the cruelty of it. The column punches through a startled German be blown, and rolls east faster than word of it can travel. But speed is a wasting asset. By dawn, March 27th, the alarm is across the region. Every German unit between the column and Hammelburg now knows an American spearhead is loose behind the line. And they begin to converge. The raiders are no longer a surprise. They are a target. The day becomes a running fight. German anti-tank guns wait on the high ground. Single-shot rocket weapons that gut a Sherman at close range, from the tree lines and the village streets. Baum's tanks burn one by one. He loses vehicles, loses men, and keeps moving, because to stop is to die. By the afternoon of March 27th, the battered column finally crests the ground above Oflag XIII-B and looks down on the wire it has bled across half of Germany to reach. Inside the camp, the prisoners hear it before they understand it. The grind of tank engines, the crack of through the barracks. They have come for us. Men too weak to stand pull themselves to the windows. For the German camp commander, General Major Günther von Possible. He cannot win a battle, but he can prevent a massacre. He decides to send prisoners out under a white flag to arrange a truce. And among the officers who volunteer to walk out toward the American guns is Lieutenant Colonel John Waters. This is the hinge of the whole story. The one-man Patton sent 300 soldiers to save is now walking on his own feet toward rescue. He carries a makeshift white flag. He is yards from the freedom his father-in-law gambled an armored column to buy, and a German soldier somewhere does not understand the flag, or does not care. He fires. Waters goes down with a bullet through his body, gravely wounded, feet from the men who came for him. The rescue, in the cruelest possible sense, has already failed, and it gets worse for Baum's men. They never even take the camp cleanly. They open a section of the wire, but they have arrived with shot-up tanks, dwindling fuel, and no room to carry 1,500 starving prisoners. Hundreds of freed men cluster around the vehicles, desperate, and there is simply no way to move them all 50 miles back, through a Germany that is now fully awake and closing in. The rescue force is itself trapped. The hunters have become the hunted, deep behind a line they can no longer reach. Baum tries to break back out at first light. It is a slaughter. German armor and infantry have ringed the column in the wooded hills, and as the Americans push west, they drive straight into the encirclement. Tanks brew up. The column comes apart in the trees. Baum himself is hit, wounded in the leg, then captured, carried into the same Hammelburg infirmary where the wounded Waters now lies. The two men whose fates Patton tied together end up in beds under the same roof. Prisoners both. The arithmetic of the disaster is brutal. Of the more than 300 men who rolled out on the night of March 26th, only a few dozen ever made it back to American lines. The rest were killed, wounded, or captured. Not one prisoner was permanently freed by the raid itself. 2 weeks later, on April 6th, regular American forces, tanks of the 14th Armored Division, simply overran Hammelburg in the ordinary advance of the front, and liberated the camp without a special mission at all. The thing Patton risked 300 men to do, the war did on its own, for free. Then came the second mission, the cover-up. Patton understood at once how the raid would look, a famous general spending an armored column to chase his own son-in-law. So he reached for an explanation. The Hammelburg operation, he insisted, had been a diversion, meant to draw German attention while the Third Army moved elsewhere. And he claimed he had not known Waters was in the camp. He awarded Captain Baum the Distinguished Service Cross at his hospital bedside, pinned to the gown, and, by some accounts, steered clear of the Medal of Honor because that decoration would have triggered a formal investigation. An investigation asks questions, but the truth has a letter to his wife naming Waters at the camp. There was Stiller, sent for no reason but to recognize a face. There was the size of the force, too small to free a camp, just right to extract a man. And there was Patton's own concession, set down in his post-war writing, that the only real error he made in the entire European campaign was failing to send a larger force, a combat command, to take Hammelburg. Not that he sent men to die for one prisoner, that he did not send enough of them, and there was Baum himself. Years afterward, recalling Patton's hospital visit, Baum said he told the general it was hard to believe he would have sent them all that way, just to rescue one man. By Baum's account, Patton looked at him and answered plainly that no, he wouldn't have. It was as close to an admission as the old general ever came. Not a denial of the mission, but a denial that one man could be worth it. The men in the column had always known better. They had paid the bill for an answer Patton would never say out loud. The men of Task Force Baum were not famous. They were tank crews and infantrymen from 100 American towns, sent into the dark on the word of a general they trusted. Captain Abraham Baum survived his wounds, lived a long life, and spent decades making sure the world knew what his men had done. John Waters survived too. He recovered, stayed in the army, and rose to 4-star general. Today, the story sits in the records of the wars of the National World War II museums, in New Orleans, in the work of the historians, refused to let it stay buried. A small disaster with a very large lesson. There is a line that separates a bold commander from a reckless one, and it is not about courage. Both kinds have plenty. It is about whose life you are willing to spend, and whether you will say so honestly afterward. Patton crossed that line in the dark outside of Schaffenburg, and then spent his last months refusing to admit where the line had been. Whether Hammelburg was a diversion or a rescue is still argued by serious people to this day. Watch where you come down. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served in Europe in any branch, leave their name and one thing about them in the comments. Don't just leave a name. Tell us one thing they did, or said, or that you remember. The men who were there deserve more than a line in a database. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.